Now, you see, by my sort of experience, a man may go to bed at night not worth a cent, and wake up in the morning to find himself immensely wealthy. And very often he is a man who has a vast cargo of ignorance. To illustrate my point, I will give you a story about a couple of those fresh nabobs whose names were Colonels Jim and Jack. Colonel Jim had seen considerable of the world, but Colonel Jack was raised down in the backwoods of Arkansas. These gentlemen, after their good luck, determined on a pleasure trip to New York. So they went to San Francisco, took a steamer, and in due time arrived in the great metropolis. While passing along the street, Colonel Jack's attention was distracted by the hacks and splendid equipages he saw, and he says, "Well, I've heard about these carriages all my life, and I mean to have a ride in one. I don't care what it costs." So Colonel Jim stepped to the edge of the sidewalk and ordered a handsome carriage. Colonel Jack says, "No, you don't. None of your cheap turnouts for me. I'm here to have a good time, and money is no object. I'm going to have the best rig this country affords. You stop that yellow one there with the pictures on it." So they got into the empty omnibus and sat down. Colonel Jack says, "Well, ain't it gay? Ain't it nice? Windows and pictures and cushions so you can't rest. What would the boys think of this if they could see us cut such a swell in New York? I wish they could see us. What is the name of this?" Colonel Jim told him it was a barouche. After a while, he poked his head out in front and said to the driver, "I say, Johnny, this suits me. We want this shebang all day. Let the horses go." The driver loosened the strap and passed his hand in for the fare. Colonel Jack, thinking that he wanted to shake hands, shook him heartily and said, "You understand me. You take care of me, and I'll take care of you." He put a $20 gold piece into the driver's hand. The driver says, "I can't change that." Colonel Jack replied, "Put it into your pocket. I don't want any change. We're going to ride it out." In a few minutes, the bus stopped and a young lady got in. Colonel Jack stared at her. Pretty soon, she got out her money to pay the driver. Colonel Jack says, "Put up your money, miss. You're perfectly welcome to ride here just as long as you want to, but this barouche is chartered and we can't let you pay." Soon an old lady got in. Colonel Jack told her to sit down. "Don't be at all uneasy. Everything is paid for and as free as if you were in your own turnout. But you can't pay a cent." Pretty soon 2 or 3 gentlemen got in and ladies with children. Colonel Jack says, "Come right along. Don't mind us. Free blowout." By and by, the crowd filled all the seats and were standing up while the others climbed up on top. He nudged to Colonel Jim and says, "Colonel, what kind of cattle do they have here? If this don't bang anything I ever saw, ain't they friendly and so awful cool about it? But they ain't sociable." But I have related enough of that circumstance to illustrate the enormous simplicity of those unfledged biddies of fortune. I reported on that morning newspaper 3 years, and it was pretty hard work. But I enjoyed its attractions. Reporting is the best school in the world to get a knowledge of human beings, human nature, and human ways. A nice, gentlemanly reporter, I make no references, is well treated by everybody. Just think of the wide range of his acquaintanceship, his experience of life and society. No other occupations brings a man into such familiar sociable relations with all grades and classes of people. The last thing at midnight, he goes browsing around after items among police and jailbirds in the lockup, questioning the prisoners and making pleasant and lasting friendships with some of the worst people on earth. And the very next evening he gets himself up, regardless of expense, puts on all the good clothes his friends have got, goes and takes dinner with the governor or the commander-in-chief of the district, the United States senator, and some more of the upper crust of society. He is on good terms with all of them and is present at every public gathering and has easy access to every variety of people. Why, I breakfasted almost every morning with the governor, dined with the principal clergyman, and slept in the station house. A reporter has to lie a little, of course, or they would discharge him. That is the only drawback to the profession. This is why I left. I am different from Washington. I have a higher and grander standard of principle. Washington could not lie. I can lie, but won't. Reporting is fascinating, but then it is distressing to have to lie so. Lying is bad. Lying is very bad. Every individual in this house knows that by experience. I think that for a man to tell a lie when he can't make anything by it is wrong. When I finished reporting on that paper, they made me chief editor. I lasted just a week. I edited that paper 6 days, and then I had 5 duels on my hands. I wouldn't have minded that if it had been the custom for those other people to challenge me. Then I would have simply declined with thanks. But it was not so. If you abused a man in the paper, if you called him names, they had no rights there, such as we have. If the man didn't like it, you had to challenge him and shoot him. Of course, I didn't want to do this, but the publisher said it was the custom. Society must be protected. If I could not do the duties of my position, he would have to hire somebody else. I didn't mind the first 3 or 4 men, but the other man, I was after him. I knew he didn't want to fight, so I was going to make all the reputation out of him I could. He got touched at something I said about him. I don't know what it was now. I called him a thief, perhaps. He fought very shy of me at first, and so I plied him with bloodthirsty challenges all the more. At last, he began to take an interest in this thing. It seemed as though he really was going to enter into it at last. All our boys were delighted at the prospect, but I was not. This was not a turn I was expecting in things. I had taken for my second a fiery, peppery little fella named Steve, full of fight and anxious to have this thing fixed up right away. He took me over into a little ravine beyond the town to practice. It was a custom to fight with Colt's heavy revolvers at 5 steps. We borrowed a stable door for a mark from a gentleman who was absent. We set up that stable door, and then we propped the fence rail up against the middle to represent my antagonist and put a squash on it to represent his head. He was a very light, thin man, very thin. The poorest kind of material for a duel. You could not expect to do anything with a scattering shot at all. But he made a splendid line shot, and it was the line that I practiced on principally. But there was no success about it. I could not hit the rail, and there was no need that I should hit the rail. The rail did not really represent him. It was a little too thin and narrow, but the squash was all right. Well, I could not hit the rail, and I could not hit the squash, and finally, when I found I could not hit the door either, and got a little discouraged. But when I noticed that I crippled one of the boys occasionally, I thought it was not so bad. I was dangerous with the pistol, but not reliable. Finally, we heard some shooting going on over in the other ravine. We knew what that meant. The other party was practicing. I didn't feel comfortable. They might straggle over the ridge and see what was going on, and when they saw no bullet hole in the barn door, it would be too much encouragement for them. Just then, a little bird, a little larger than a sparrow, lit on the sagebrush nearby. Steve whipped out his revolver and shot its head off. The boys picked up the bird, and we were talking about it when the other dueling party came over the ridge and came down to see what was going on. When the second saw the bird, he said, "How far off was that?" Steve said, "About 30 steps. "Who did that?" "Why, Twain, man, of course." "Did he, indeed? Can he do that often?" "Well, he can do that about 4 times in 5. I knew that little rascal was lying, but I didn't like to tell him so. I was one of those kind of men that don't like to be too frank or too familiar in a matter like that, so I didn't say anything. But it was a comfort to see those fellas' underjaws drop, to see them turn blue about the gills and look sick. They went off and got their man and took him home, and when I got home I found a little note from those parties, peremptorily declining the fight. How sore the boys were, how indignant they were, and so was I. But I was not distressed about it. I thought I could stand it, perhaps. Well, I was out of that scrape, and I didn't want to get to any more of them, so I turned the other 4 duels over to Steve, who wanted them. But when those people found out afterward that he did that shooting but didn't get any good out of his duels, they wouldn't fight him. All that was in my younger days when I didn't know much, which I do now. I didn't know any better then, but now I am bitterly opposed to dueling. I think that dueling is immoral and has a bad tendency, and I think it is every man's duty to frown down and discourage dueling. I do. I discourage it on all occasions. If a man were to challenge me now, I would go and take that man by the hand and lead him to a quiet, private room and kill him. Ladies and gentlemen, after thanking you heartily for the attention you have given me this evening, I desire to wish you a very pleasant good night, and at the same time assure you earnestly that I have told nothing but the truth, and I have hardly exaggerated that.